Around the world, and especially in the United States recently, books are being challenged, banned, and even burned more and more. In response to this, Penguin Random House recently announced the creation of a very special edition of a frequently banned book. Margaret Atwood has teamed up with Sotheby's auction house to create the Unburnable book, a completely fireproof copy of The Handmaid's Tale, where everything from the pages to the dust jacket to the ink has been tested during manufacturing with fire. The one-off book was recently auctioned by Sotheby's and sold for $130,000, all of which is going to PEN America, a non-profit organization that works to defend and celebrate free expression in the US and worldwide through the advancement of literature and human rights. The Handmaid's Tale is one of my favorite books, having done a dive into its history in my very first video on this channel. And let's face it, Margaret Atwood is a badass. But while this is perhaps the most successful fireproof book to date, it is by no means the first attempt at making such a statement edition. Nearly 70 years ago, a special fireproof edition was made of another classic dystopian book, one that itself deals with the dangers of censorship and meeting books with flames. Welcome to Squirrel's Bookshelf and the second episode in my banned books series. Fahrenheit 451, the temperature at which book paper catches fire and burns. Okay, scientists have actually placed the auto-ignition temperature of paper at somewhere between 424 and 475 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the type of paper. But really, who cares? When Ray Bradbury called his local fire department asking what the correct temperature was, 451 degrees was what he was told, and thus he had the title to what would become one of the greatest dystopian novels of all time. Now, I, like probably many folks, first read Fahrenheit 451 in school as part of my English curriculum. So I was around 14 or 15 when I first met the fireman known as Guy Montag. For those of you who haven't read the book yet, let me first explain what a fireman is. This is, after all, set in the future, at a time when all buildings are built to be fireproof. So a fireman's job is not to put out fires, it's to start them. But firemen don't just burn things haphazardly. It's still a job. They still sit in a firehouse and wait for an alarm to call them to duty. But that duty is burning books. Reading books, after all, is dangerous and therefore illegal. Instead, everyone has a wall TV at home to receive their information and get their entertainment. A wall TV can be monitored, controlled, and censored. Books, on the other hand, allow you to think for yourself, which leads to conflict and an unhappy society.
The only way to be happy is for everyone to be made equal. So, we must burn the books, Montag. All the books.
So Guy Montag spends his days burning down homes in which books are found, and he enjoys it. That is, until one day when he accidentally glances at a single line in a book of fairy tales. Then another job where he secretly steals a book. Needless to say, the system ultimately turns on him, and he ends up being chased out of town by one of the giant mechanical dogs that, let's say, enforce the law. Fahrenheit 451 is one of Ray Bradbury's masterpieces for sure, warning us about the dangers of censorship and losing our humanity and minds to screens. Bradbury was inspired by the concern during the McCarthy era of the 1940s and 50s that the government would control more and more of the media, particularly when society was becoming more reliant on television. This sort of information access through screens, albeit now smaller ones that can fit in our pockets, is still a very potent topic today, and is possibly why this story has withstood the test of time. But every story has its beginning, and this novel was a decade in the making. The first editions of Fahrenheit 451 were published in 1953, but the ideas and themes had been developing in Bradbury's mind long before that. From getting his first library card at 7 years old, Ray Bradbury developed a love of libraries. Books were his friends, his loves. At age 12, he learned about the burning of the libraries of Alexandria 2,000 years ago. Despite his youth, this discovery truly pained him. And when Hitler began burning books in the streets of Berlin, Bradbury was 15. His young imagination was captivated by the ideas of libraries and books burning, which manifested in many of his short stories starting in 1943, many of which were forgotten until some 50 years later. One story, however, stood out. When asked over the years what the basis of Fahrenheit 451 was, Bradbury typically referred to a particular short story he wrote in 1951, following a peculiar encounter he had.
I wrote a story called The Pedestrian because I had an encounter with a policeman one night who asked me what I was doing. I was walking with a friend, and I said to the policeman, I'm putting one foot after the other, which was the wrong answer, very suspicious being a pedestrian walking. So the policeman reprimanded me, and I promised never to walk again, and I went home in a rage and I wrote this short story.
Soon after this encounter, Bradbury penned The Pedestrian, a short story following Leonard Mead, a man living in the year 2131, but thoroughly unsuited for his time. The story opens with him taking in the sights and sounds of the evening. Then, a bright light stops him in his tracks. The last police car left in a city devoid of crime, stopping the last pedestrian. The key scene in this 4-page-long story appears to be a direct reflection of Bradbury's own encounter with the policeman. The story ends with the unmanned, self-driving police car ordering him to get inside, where he will then be taken to a psychiatric center for research on regressive tendencies. Bradbury would later claim Leonard Mead to show the beginnings of Guy Montag. There is certainly a clear nod to this story at the beginning of 451, when Guy runs into a fellow rare pedestrian named Clarice McClelland, and she tells the story of her uncle being arrested for being a pedestrian. Oh, we're most peculiar. But while Bradbury claimed for the longest time the pedestrian was the earliest origin of 451, he eventually realized he had previously written another short story around 1947 or 48 entitled Bright Phoenix. In this short story, only about 6 pages long, the year is 2022. I know. The reader is plonked into the perspective of a librarian named Tom, who is approached by Jonathan Barnes, the newly appointed chief censor. He has brought a team of men and is there to burn the library's books as a government experiment. Now, I loved The Pedestrian, but this story's absolute brilliance is in the response of both the librarian and the people just sitting in the library reading. They acknowledge the imposition, but just let it happen. The librarian simply asked them to do their job quietly. Despite sending it off to a few select markets, the story was ultimately dismissed and sat around in Bradbury's files for years. Looking back, it's clear that both stories gave Bradbury 2 of the key foundations to Fahrenheit 451. The Pedestrian set the scene of a future dominated by screens, and created a rebellious character who was too intrigued by the so-called old ways. But Bright Phoenix introduced the book-burning premise. These 2 short stories were ultimately published later on. The Pedestrian was first printed in the August 7, 1951 issue of The Reporter, kickstarting Bradbury's 7-year association with the magazine. Subsequently, The Pedestrian appeared in the February 1952 edition of Fantasy and Science Fiction and became a popular reprint. Bright Phoenix, however, took about 15 years to see print, appearing much later in the May 1963 edition of Fantasy and Science Fiction, a full decade after the publication of Fahrenheit 451. But both of these stories were essentially still sitting around unread when Bradbury began the first iteration of what would become Fahrenheit 451. I didn't know it, but I was literally writing a dime novel. In the decade or so prior, Bradbury had been typing up his stories in the family garage. But unfortunately, his children were far too much of a distraction, always coming up to the windows and pulling his attention away, as he would always prioritize playing with his girls over writing a story. So he had to find somewhere else to write. It was his family's income after all, but he couldn't afford an office. Bradbury ultimately took his ideas into the basement of UCLA's Powell Library and rented out typewriters at 10 cents per half hour. As he recalled, You thrust your dime in, the clock ticked madly, and you typed wildly to finish before the half hour ran out. 9 days and $9.80 in dimes later, he emerged with a 25,000-word first draft of a new novella in the basement of a library in 1950. This original draft was titled Long After Midnight, not to be confused with the short story and collection published in 1976 under the same name. Long After Midnight then became The Fireman, which, after many failed attempts, was published in the February 1951 issue of Galaxy Science Fiction. It was interesting to learn, however, that in publishing The Fireman in Galaxy Science Fiction, still a relatively new digest format magazine, suggestions were made to change Montag and the book people at the end of the story, those who kept particular books alive in their memories. It was suggested that their memories of the books should be corrupted by commercial advertisements or unrelated literary fragments. Bradbury, however, decided this would be too pessimistic and would destroy any hope for restoration at the end of the story. As such, The Fireman was printed with very little alteration from his original script. Still only half the novel it would eventually become, The Fireman really was the publishing start of Fahrenheit 451, introducing the character of Montag and setting up the entire plot just in a more concise format. It was soon overshadowed by Fahrenheit 451, meaning that it only saw one reprint in the 20th century, in the Fawcett paperback Science Fiction Origins published in 1980. Original typescript material for The Fireman, Fireman written as two separate words then, is preserved in the Archives and Special Collections section of the Pollock Library at California State University, Fullerton, along with around 200 pages showing various stages of revision. However, Long After Midnight has had portions lost, recovered, and sold over the years. Now, in retrospect, there were far more early stories that led, if not linearly, to the popular novel. These stories tested variations of the Montag character, introduced the censorship and/or burning of books, displayed worlds reliant on and controlled by technology more and more, minimizing individual thought and attention, and commented on senseless ongoing wars. And they were heavily influenced by the times. World War II was over and America was in a state of prosperity. Yet Bradbury, as a young man, grew bitter with modernity, feeling that people were losing the ability to live authentically, to take pauses and reflect in life, to enjoy things like reading, which required a much longer attention span than the ever-shortening clips of stories on radio and television. On top of that, there was a new threat of nuclear war thanks to the Soviet Union. These new aspects of life weighed heavily on the stories written in this period of his life in his 20s. But, as I mentioned, Bradbury had largely forgotten these stories over the subsequent years. But then, in 2006, Bradbury's memory was given a little nudge, and Gauntlet Publications published Match to Flame, The Fictional Paths to Fahrenheit 451, a collection of letters, short stories, and facsimile rough drafts of previously unpublished works, all of which were written in the decade leading up to Fahrenheit 451. These include The Pedestrian and Bright Phoenix, among many other short stories, The Fireman, finally reprinted after decades, and the only known complete version of Long After Midnight. Match to Flame had a limited edition run of 750 copies, each signed by Bradbury. And for any Bradbury fans, this book is an absolute treasure. Full disclosure though, the limited print run on these does make them a bit pricey. Luckily, for those with tighter budgets, another collection called A Pleasure to Burn was published later in 2010, named after the opening line of the novel. This was yet another collection of the stories leading up to Fahrenheit 451, and in fact contains most, though not all, of the short stories found in Match to Flame, including all 4 stories mentioned previously. But Match to Flame does give the most complete look at the genesis of Fahrenheit 451. Although The Fireman was complete and published, Bradbury felt a strong urge that there was more to be written. This urge exploded after he attended a performance of Darkness at Noon, a play adapted from the novel of the same name by Arthur Koestler. To see a novel that had so influenced him be brought to life fully in front of his eyes gave him the determination to bring his novella up to its full potential. A contract was secured in 1952 from Ian Ballantine of Ballantine Books for a new story collection, and The Fireman was at the forefront. After some intermittent revisions, Bradbury took the Fireman back down to the same basement library at UCLA for another 9-day burst, emerging at last with a novel. Within the revision and expansion of the story, a few changes were made. Leonard Montag became Guy Montag. The Fireman was set in 2052, while Fahrenheit 451 was vaguely set in the distant future. Although a coda of Bradbury's does specify, 1999. The screens known as televisors were instead referred to as parlor walls, and the electric hound became the mechanical hound and had a direct encounter with Montag. The mechanical hound, by the way, taking inspiration from the Sherlock Holmes novel, The Hound of the Baskervilles. But overall, the complete story was kept intact. Bradbury, however, did decide he wanted a flashier title for the new publication. He first called the UCLA chemistry and physics departments, asking at what temperature paper burned, but they couldn't give him an answer. That's when he turned to the Los Angeles Fire Department, who, frankly, didn't know either. But they found a specialized reference book that provided a temperature in both Celsius and Fahrenheit. So really, the book could have been titled Centigrade 233 instead. But of course, Bradbury went with the alternate option, and in 1953, the first editions of Fahrenheit 451 were published in the USA by Bal-Hi Books. Now, it's quite common to think of a first edition of a book being a hardback, but this isn't always the case. In the world of science fiction particularly, it is quite common that the first edition is a paperback, and sometimes a book is released simultaneously in both hardback and paperback forms. I've actually read conflicting accounts of the publication history of 451, but in an interview in the 50th anniversary edition, Bradbury did say that Bal-Hi released both a hardcover and softcover edition on the same day in October 1953. This account seems to align with Bal-Hi's other publication history. At a time when science fiction was printed almost exclusively in pulp magazine format and generally discarded by educated readers, the emerging imprint came up with a brilliant new business idea. They would publish new works in hardcover and paperback editions simultaneously, allowing bookstores, which at the time sold only hardbacks, to carry their books under a new adult science fiction label, garnering a more sophisticated readership. Meanwhile, train stations and drugstores could continue to sell mass-market paperbacks, subsidizing the cost of the hardcover run. This means that there are multiple first editions. The first paperback edition has a blue cover unique from all other paperback printings, so it's easy enough to identify. By the second and third printings, the covers had already changed. Alongside 451, the book also contains two other Bradbury short stories, titled The Playground and the Rock Cried Out. These were also included in the various first hardback editions I'll cover shortly, but they were removed in subsequent printings. The first paperback edition originally sold for 35 cents, as essentially a cheap preview of the hardback edition. In fact, a page near the rear of the book reads, "If you enjoyed this book as much as we hope you did, you will want copies of the permanently bound edition for your library and as gifts for your friends." Hint, hint, wink, wink. In fairness, there is probably a reason why the hardcover is more desirable among collectors. It is, as the paperback goes on to describe, printed on better grade paper with wider margins, is bound attractively in boards, and is jacketed. The price is $2.50 per copy. Oh, I wish. Anyone have a time machine? Nowadays, the first hardback edition, especially in its dust jacket, can fetch thousands of dollars. Its now famous cover was designed by Joseph Munyaini, who collaborated with Ray Bradbury on other publications as well. But as desirable as this book is for collectors, there are two other first editions that fetch even more, two special limited editions. For starters, Bradbury commissioned 50 specially bound copies for his own personal use. Beneath the dust jacket, these copies were bound in a nicer presentation red cloth, stamped in gilt, and personally inscribed by Bradbury to his chosen few. This is the scarcest of the first editions, but not the most intriguing of them. Now, do you remember Margaret Atwood's Unburnable book? Well, like I said, someone else had the same idea some 70 years earlier. The final first edition of Fahrenheit 451 was a limited edition bound in Johns Manville Quintera, an asbestos material with exceptional resistance to pyrolysis. Yup. This bad boy was fireproof. Well, at least the binding was. The pages were still paper, so I think Atwood's wins. But still, the thought was there in 1953. The asbestos edition was given a limited run of 200 copies, although a letter from Bradbury suggests it was actually around 215 copies, each numbered and signed by the author. Because of their scarcity, they are often in the 4 to 5 figure price range. Even if I could afford to have one someday, I probably won't ever be looking to add this to my collection, given what we as a society now know about the dangers of asbestos. On the other hand, there are some unique editions I would love to have in my collection that I'm going to throw in here as honorable mentions. Another purportedly fire-resistant edition was published in 1982 for the Limited Edition Club. This 2,000-copy print run featured a new introduction by Bradbury and oil painting illustrations by Joseph Munyaini, the same artist who designed the original cover. It was bound in fire-resistant aluminum silver foil and was signed by both author and artist. Over the years, though, new binding concepts were devised. This here is a uniquely bound copy of Fahrenheit 451 designed by artist Elizabeth Perez. Like Atwood's Unburnable book, this is sadly a one-of-a-kind concept creation and not available for purchase, but it is every bit as genius in my eyes, albeit for the opposite reason. Perez, quote, wanted to spread the book-burning message to the book itself, and designed a book cover with a single removable inset match posing as the number 1 and a screen-printed matchbox striking paper surface along the spine, encouraging the reader to set it alight. I also stumbled upon this edition, a prototype created by French graphic design firm Super Terrain and unveiled in October 2017. Using technology developed by researchers at Jan van Eyck Academy in the Netherlands, this book uses a unique charcoal-based heat-activated ink which becomes visible when warm and fades away once the pages have cooled down, meaning it can only be read by applying heat to its pages. Upon its initial publication, Fahrenheit 451 was met with mixed reviews. Some found it a brilliantly imaginative and visionary work of social commentary. Others, such as the New York Times, criticized Bradbury for developing a virulent hatred for many aspects of present-day culture. The novel had a strong debut, but because of the controversy, it didn't really take off. That is, until an emerging young editor approached Bradbury looking for quality writing to include in his new upscale men's magazine.
And then a young editor came along a few years later who had no money and he needed material and said, "Can you sell me something for $400? And I said, "Yes, I have a novel, Fahrenheit 451, and he bought it for $400, and that was Hugh Hefner.
According to Hefner's daughter, he had read the paperback when it came out and loved the story.
He would say that he was a big fan of the work, and so he thought this is a chance to kind of put a big stake in the ground in terms of bringing to our audience this important and powerful work. And so he wrote to Ray, have felt that it was the kind of fiction that was both of its time and timeless.
Fahrenheit 451 appeared in Playboy in the March, April, and May issues of 1954, the 4th, 5th, and 6th issues ever. Yes, I do have a copy of this one issue, strictly for the articles, of course. Some speculate that the story's ultimate success is due to this Playboy readership, launching it into the broader public psyche. Perhaps we'll never know. But after that, both the book and the magazine became great successes. Then in the 1970s and 80s, Bradbury adapted his book into a 2-act play. In his afterword and later editions of the novel, Bradbury described how he called his characters out of the shadows to ask what was new since 1953, and they answered. New scenes offered new insights into his characters. For instance, Fire Chief Beatty's history as an avid reader was suddenly revealed. How his love for books died after some tragic life events left him feeling blank when looking at a page again. Beatty's house remains filled with books, which takes Montag by surprise on a visit, but Beatty reminds him that owning books isn't illegal, reading them is. and he doesn't read a word anymore. From his original story to the additions in his play adaptation, Bradbury insists that his writing comes from his secret subconscious, naturally pouring out from his characters rather than from himself. Whatever one's philosophy, there may be some truth to such notions. Upon much later reflection, Bradbury realized that Montag was named after a paper manufacturing company, and Faber, the name of the philosopher character, is a pencil manufacturer. What a sly thing my subconscious was, to name them thus, and not tell me. As we've discussed so far, Fahrenheit 451 is all about censorship. But was the book ever censored itself? From what I can tell, Fahrenheit 451 was never successfully banned, but it certainly was challenged and even incurred some unwelcome alterations in its publication. In January 1967, Ballantine Books released a special Bal-Hi edition aimed at high school students, which had been altered and sanitized to avoid offending the young, innocent minds. She says sarcastically. I mean, it was the late 60s, I guess. For example, the first difference I found was on page 10, when the phrase, "so damned late at night," was changed to exclude the word damned. Shocking. The Bal-Hi edition also censored certain other words and other passing sexual references, and changed a drunk man to a sick man among its 75 modified passages and 2 modified episodes. For many years, the censored version was available alongside the original version, until 1971, when a reprinting accidentally switched the original with the censored Bal-Hi edition. By 1973, Ballantine was publishing only the censored version, until a friend brought it to Bradbury's attention in 1979. Bradbury was outraged and ordered the censored version to be immediately withdrawn and replaced with the original, which was corrected in 1980 with a new coda. Fire Captain Beatty, in my novel Fahrenheit 451, described how the books were burned first by minorities, each ripping a page or a paragraph from this book and that, until the day came when the books were empty and the mines shut and the libraries closed forever. I discovered that, over the years, Ballantine Books, fearful of contaminating the young, had bit by bit censored some 75 separate sections from the novel. Students reading the novel wrote to tell me of this exquisite irony. With all the dams and hells back in place, the Bal-Hi editions were discontinued, later being referenced by the publisher as revised Bal-Hi editions. Ever since, the original text has commonly been used in school curriculums, where it faced some further challenges. What might surprise you, though, is when these challenges occurred. I found 2 or 3 instances of attempted bans in school curriculums, all of which occurred in the 21st century. In 2008, the book was challenged in the Conroe Independent School District in Texas because it was against the complainant's religious beliefs by discussing being drunk, smoking cigarettes, violence, quote, dirty talk, references to the Bible, and using God's name in vain. Then, and it's not clear if this is the same Texas incident or not, at a special panel presentation in July 2013 at the American Library Association, a librarian named Lois Buckman also told the story of a Texas high school facing calls to ban the book. The father of a young girl who attended the school claimed that it was a filthy book and insulted our fireman and requested that the book be banned. Even as recently as 2018, Fahrenheit 451 received a formal ban request at the Santa Rosa District Schools in Florida. Required there as part of the 8th grade school curriculum, one parent objected to the book's profanity, mature subject matter, violence, and again, its pattern of using God's name in vain. She called it filth and stated, "I'm just trying to keep my little girl a little girl." Some students even planned a petition to ban the novel for good at Santa Rosa District Schools. Thankfully, the review committee and the superintendent supported retaining the book, although they did give the students an option to choose another book. It does seem a bit ironic to me that many challenges to books such as Fahrenheit 451 come from religious, particularly Christian motivations. They claim the subject matter is too mature or violent for children, but I mean, have you read the Bible? In any case, Fahrenheit 451 has so far persevered in preparing adolescents to become thoughtful, engaged citizens over the past nearly 50 years. I, for one, sure hope that never changes, because that would bring our world one step closer to that of Guy Montag's. And the thought of burning down my lovely little library is a ghastly thought indeed. Thank you so much for watching, and do let me know in the comments if there are other banned books that you would like to learn a little more about. Until next time, be kind, be curious, and be effective. Bye! One of the greatest dystopian novels of all. I was almost there. Guy Montag. No, that's not it. All buildings are built to be fireproof. Published in 1950. Censorship or banning 19. I am so close. How her uncle, the Alexandria. Burning. I'm listening to 1984 right now, and I keep wanting to say that. At the genesis of... I almost said it again. It's to such notions. Ooh, that's a mouthful. Why did I write that?